Late Archaic period in ancient prehistoric Michigan. Most of my experience has been with late woodland and middle woodland cultures, so it was quite exciting for me to happen upon a late archaic site that no one else seems to know existed. A good question would be, why do I believe this site to be late archaic? And I'll answer that question as we go along. While I am talking with you, though, the photos you'll be looking at are images of the actual relics that I have found. This has been an awesome journey for me, and I hope you will find it interesting also. The three archaic periods in Michigan, early, middle, and late, covered a period between 8,000 and 500 BC. For the purpose here, the late archaic period lasted from 3000 BC till 500 BC, and I have found very little written about this area during that time frame. So I will be drawing some conclusions based on information that is published about the period as a whole, as well as on the artifacts that I have myself found. If I am correct about the time period, then the people who would have lived there would have depended on hunting, fishing, and collecting a large variety of plant foods. From what I have been able to read, it appears that the late archaic people were wanderers who established their homes near where food was most easily found, and when the food was depleted, they would move on. Some sources state that it is likely that some camps remained fairly permanent bases when sizable groups of people congregated periodically, and by the same token, other sites were quite small and temporary, perhaps occupied by a single family for a short period of time. And this single family concept is what I believe this site I have come across was. On woodland sites that I worked some time ago now, you could look at the stone tools and the pottery and see the individual styles indicated that many different people were at work in the same area. But here at this site, all the pieces found look as though they were made by one man or a small group of closely related men and women. Something unusual here is that one, these artifacts are by and large very crude in manufacture, and two, there's a complete absence of pottery at the site. And the absence of pottery helps lead me to the conclusion that this is an archaic site because pottery did not come in until the early woodland periods. The stone artifacts, as I said, are very crude. This does not necessarily mean they are of any particular period, but it does lend itself to earlier time frames in my estimation. The tool assemblage I have found at this site consists of partial arrowheads, celts, gorgets, drills, microblades, mace heads, and knives. There were also a few pieces that might be considered tools for processing food, such as finger pestles. Some sources indicate that there was a growing emphasis on trade and ceremonialism in the late archaic times that foreshadowed developments among the cultures of the woodland tradition. There is a wonderful paragraph written by Jill Arnold of the Archives of Michigan about our state's prehistory. I'd like to quote a paragraph here. Michigan's story is mostly unwritten. It is mostly a Native American Indian story. Almost all we know about the thousands of years before English-speaking settlers we have learned through Native American tradition and clues discovered by archaeologists. I'm not going to debate the point here of who makes the most significant contribution to archaeology, but I want to give my opinion, and that is that dedicated avocational archaeologists have made just as much, if not more, of a contribution than the professional archaeologists. By and large, it is avocational archaeologists that have found sites, particularly, say, in the last 40 or 50 years. But I'd like to quote one more paragraph from Miss Arnold's writing. And I quote, "Thousands of years ago, the land we know as Michigan was shaped by glaciers. Long before there were people living here, ice a mile thick moved slowly back and forth across the state. The ice acted like a huge bulldozer, scraping and gouging the land's surface." End quote. That's hard to imagine. But during the archaic periods, Michigan and its inhabitants went through lots of changes. As the Middle Archaic dawned in Michigan, the environment was changing. The people looked for new ways to make use of their resources. New types of tools came about, which gave a great assist to them as they gathered food and produced items for everyday survival. The people learned how to grind and polish stones like granite, and to work it by the arc pecking method. At the site I have found, there bone appears to have been used as raw material for certain types of tools. Now, I ask you to please understand as I go through the artifacts that I have found that I am not a professional archaeologist. But I have learned a lot in the past 35 years. And what I can tell you about this site, based on how small an area that I could observe, is my best opinion of what transpired here. But please understand that there may be other interpretations of the site and the artifacts. And when I worked at the Goodwin Gresham site and the Old Benetton Creek site in Oscoda, Michigan, the artifacts formed three categories. 1. Stone or lithics, 2. Pottery or ceramics, and 3. Bone remains of food production. At this site, artifacts are represented by 2 basic categories, which are 1. Lithics and 2. Bone. There is 1 copper artifact that was found there, and this too lends to the credibility of it being a late archaic site. There is a complete absence of pottery, as ceramics did not come into use, as I said, in Michigan until the early woodland period, about 800 BC. However, with the absence of pottery, there are quite an amazing array of stone and bone pieces, much more abundant than on sites of the woodland traditions. In fact, though most pieces are quite crude, there were quite a few pieces that really surprised me, as they were very unexpected. To begin with, the site, well, like the 2 mace heads, for example. But to begin with, the site today is very sandy, and I believe that it would have been that case when it was originally occupied all those thousands of years ago now. All the pieces I have found were on the surface of the ground, and as such were under a house that was built in the 1890s, which helped preserve the site. As we have had heavy rains and winds, more and more items have been brought out to the surface by natural process. Based on the small area I have looked at, I believe this was a small group of people, perhaps a family unit. There is no way I can determine how many that would be at present. Now, this was going to be a much more in-depth report to you, but some restrictions from YouTube because of a mistake that I made, and it was a mistake, has me not able to make videos over 15 minutes long. So I'll actually break this probably in 2 parts so that you can see all the photographs. The photographs will be, as you can see already, captioned so that you know exactly what you're looking at. But I'm going to read a piece from you about the Archaic period, again, 8,000 to 500 BC. And this was written about Ohio, but as I see things, I don't think that it would have been much different here in Michigan and in the Saginaw Valley. And that report goes, the economy of archaic cultures depended on hunting, fishing, and collecting a wide variety of plant foods in an essentially modern environment. Recent evidence from Kentucky and Tennessee indicates that late archaic people may have domesticated squash around 2300 BC. People became increasingly efficient in their adaptation to various environments throughout the Ohio area. Archaic communities established camps in various parts of their territories during different seasons of the year according to the availability of food resources. Some of those camps remained fairly permanent bases where sizable groups of people congregated periodically. Others were quite small and temporary, perhaps occupied by a single family for a short period of time. In addition to chipping spear points and knives from flint, the archaic people learned how to make axes and various types of food processing tools by grinding and polishing hard stones such as granite, and also by the use of the arc pecking method. A growing emphasis on trade and ceremonialism in late archaic times foreshadowed developments among the cultures of the woodlands. I'm sure, as you can tell by the background noise, that people are gearing up for the 4th of July. I would like to continue reading from another paper about, just titled, Looking at Prehistory, Early Archaic Period, 8,000 to 6,000 BC. This was published or prepared by Indiana's Hoosier National Forest Service. And their report begins, the early Archaic period is a time when hardwood forests and prairies were established in Indiana in response to the warming climate after the Ice Age. White-tailed deer became a primary source of meat for archaic peoples, along with black bear, elk, and many smaller animals that live in Indiana today, as well as in our area. The Indiana black bear and elk were finally hunted to extinction by around 1850. Collections housed at the Glen A. Black Laboratory of Archaeology contain a black bear skull, reportedly found near Hazleton, Indiana, that exhibits a round hole in the skull, indicating a musket or rifle was used to kill the animal. Bison were numerous and heavily exploited on the Central Plains during the Paleo-Indian and early Archaic periods, but not in the eastern United States. However, and this is my interjection here, it is believed that buffalo did have their territory that extended into the Great Lakes here. Continuing with the report, though, early Archaic people, much like the Paleo-Indian people, frequently changed the locations of their hunting and collecting camps to take advantage of hunting opportunities. Their camps were most often small and only used for a short time. A campfire or two with some rocks and debris from making tools, along with a few broken and worn-out tools, is all that many sites contain. While there is no archaeological evidence of structures during the early Archaic and the early Paleo-Indian periods, their homes were probably made with poles and covered with hide, grass, and bark, depending upon their location, or the location of the camp and the available building materials. These remains are so old and scarce that little has survived to help us understand these people and their lives. Early Archaic peoples are no doubt descended from the earlier Paleo-Indian people, but the genetic relationships can only be determined generally because early human remains that can be used for genetic analysis are scarce and widely scattered. Based on the numerous types of tools and the wide geographical dispersal of the tools, we can be sure that there were numerous individual groups of people, more or less related, but nonetheless distinct in their own right, and the same statement applies to what we know from many later archaeological periods. Like Clovis and earlier Paleo-Indian peoples, early Archaic people frequently revisited chert quarries, or flint quarries, where large pieces of high-quality chert could be used to make projectile points and butchering tools. Early Archaic projectile points are some of the most common and readily recognized tools in prehistory because they are larger than average. Were made in large numbers, and were left by the thousands on hunting camps that were spread across the landscape in areas of Indiana and also throughout the Great Lakes region. To conclude this portion, I would like to say that lithics are the primary artifacts that I've recovered at this site, and while there are some very recognizable forms, most are obscure, slightly modified pieces like Cabelmano's hammering stones and pieces such as that. So with that said, enjoy looking at the rest of the photos. If they do not fit in my 15-minute restriction, I will do a part 2 with the photographs. Hey, thanks for stopping by and checking things out. You guys and gals are always appreciated. God bless and have a great evening.